This story is entirely fictional and created solely for entertainment purposes. All characters, locations, and events are products of imagination. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. They called him the Devil of Blackmere, and he had never once corrected them. Not when the name traveled through Parliament like smoke through cracked stone. Not when lesser lords used it to frighten their children into obedience. Not when his own servants whispered it behind doors they believed were thick enough to keep secrets. Duke Lucien Raventhorne had been called worse things by people who no longer had tongues to repeat the mistake. And if you think a man like that would soften by the end of this story, stay until the last word. You might be right. You might be dead wrong. Either way, you will not look away. Bakikichi. The rain had not stopped for 6 days. It fell against Blackmere Keep like a punishment the sky had been saving, hammering the ancient battlements until the mortar wept gray tears down walls that had stood for 3 centuries. Inside the war chamber on the eastern tower, Duke Lucien Raventhorne stood with his back to the only fire in the room and read the letter for the 4th time. Not because the words were difficult, because the audacity behind them required a certain kind of patience to absorb without destroying something. The letter was from the Crown's Chancellor, Lord Pemberton, a man whose political survival depended entirely on his ability to broker arrangements between families who despised each other. The language was diplomatic. The intent was not. Lucien set the letter on the oak table and pressed both fists against the wood until his knuckles went white. He was 34 years old. He had inherited Blackmere at 19 after his father's death, a death most of the aristocracy still debated the nature of, though none debated it within earshot of the Duke. In the 15 years since, Lucien had transformed Blackmere from a crumbling northern stronghold into the most feared seat of power outside the capital. He controlled the iron trade. He held the loyalty of 4 border garrisons. He had broken 2 attempted coups before the conspirators had finished writing their manifestos. And now the crown wanted him to take a wife. Not just any wife. Lady Seraphina Vale, daughter of the disgraced Marquis of Ashford, whose gambling debts and failed speculations had reduced one of the oldest families in the kingdom to a name without a coin behind it. The arrangement was simple in the way only political extortion could be. The crown would forgive the Vale family's debts to the treasury. In return, Lucien would receive the appearance of legitimacy that a noble marriage provided, and the chancellor would gain leverage over the one duke he could not control. Lucien understood leverage. He had built his empire on it. What he did not understand was why anyone believed he would accept a leash disguised as a wedding ring. "You have been staring at that letter long enough to have memorized it in Latin," said Aldrich Voss from the doorway. Lucien did not turn. Aldrich was the only man alive who entered rooms without knocking and left them without permission. He had been Lucien's father's steward before becoming something closer to a shadow for the sun. 60 years old, built like a watchtower that had survived one too many sieges, Aldrich possessed the rare gift of saying exactly what Lucien did not want to hear at exactly the moment it needed to be said. "The Chancellor wants me domesticated," Lucien said. "The Chancellor wants you predictable. There is a difference, though I suspect neither appeals to you." Lucien finally turned. The firelight carved his face into planes of amber and darkness. He was not handsome in the way portraits demanded. His features were too sharp, his jaw too angular, the scar that ran from his left temple to his cheekbone too prominent to ignore. But there was a gravity to him, a density of presence that made rooms feel smaller when he occupied them. People did not look at Lucien Raventhorne because he was pleasant to observe. They looked because something primal in their blood told them to keep watching. "Tell me about the girl," he said. Aldrich moved to the sideboard and poured 2 glasses of whiskey without asking. He handed one to Lucien and kept the other. Lady Seraphina Vale, 23, educated at the Hargrove Academy before her father's debts forced her withdrawal, reportedly intelligent, reportedly stubborn, reportedly the only member of the Vale household who attempted to prevent the financial collapse by petitioning the trade guilds directly. Reportedly. "My sources are reliable." "Your sources told me Lord Ashwick was planning a trade embargo 6 months ago. He was planning a wedding for his daughter." Aldrich took a slow drink. "I never claimed perfection. I claimed usefulness." Lucien walked to the narrow window and looked out at the storm-drowned landscape. Blackmere Keep sat on a granite ridge above the Ashenmere Valley, and from this height the world below looked like it was drowning. Fields turned to lakes, roads turned to rivers. The village at the base of the ridge huddled against the weather like something waiting to be punished further. He had built all of this, not inherited it, built it. The inheritance had been a ruin and a reputation. Everything else, the iron contracts, the military alliances, the trade routes that made Blackmere indispensable to the crown's economy, he had constructed through a combination of brilliance, brutality, and an absolute refusal to need anyone. And now they wanted to install a stranger in his fortress. "When does she arrive?" he asked. 3 days. The Chancellor's escort is already en route from Ashford. I did not agree to this. You did not refuse it either. In the Chancellor's vocabulary, that constitutes agreement. Lucien drained his glass and set it down hard enough to crack the base. Prepare the East Wing and Aldrich. Your Grace. If she arrives expecting a fairy tale, make sure the staff disabuses her of that notion before she reaches the main hall. Aldrich studied the Duke for a moment with the particular expression of a man who had watched a boy become something formidable and occasionally wondered what had been lost in the process. I will ensure the welcome is appropriately Blackmere. He left without another word. Lucien stood at the window and watched the storm. Somewhere beyond that curtain of rain, a woman he had never met was traveling toward his gates, carrying nothing but a ruined name and whatever stubborn idiocy had made her agree to this arrangement. He would let her stay long enough to satisfy the Chancellor. Then he would make her understand that Blackmere Keep consumed everything soft that entered its walls. It was not cruelty. It was architecture. You did not build a fortress and then leave the gates open because someone arrived with flowers. Lady Seraphina Vale arrived on the 3rd day, exactly as Aldrich had predicted, though nothing else about her arrival followed prediction. The Chancellor's escort consisted of 4 mounted guards and a diplomatic attaché named Whitmore, who had the nervous energy of a man delivering a package he suspected might explode. They came through the main gate of Blackmere at midday, the horses steaming in the cold, the carriage wheels cutting deep ruts in the mudstone courtyard. Lucien watched from the upper gallery. He had no intention of greeting her at the gate. Greeting someone at the gate implied eagerness, and eagerness was a form of surrender he had eliminated from his vocabulary before he turned 20. He expected her to emerge from the carriage slowly. He expected fine clothes designed to impress, careful posture, a rehearsed expression of courage. He expected the performance of nobility. What he got was a woman who stepped out of the carriage before the footman could reach the door, who looked up at the brutal facade of Blackmere Keep with an expression not of awe but of assessment, and who turned to the diplomatic attaché and said something that made the man go pale. Lucien leaned forward slightly. Aldrich appeared beside him. She refused the formal welcome procession. On what grounds? She told Whitmore that if the Duke could not be bothered to greet her himself, she would not perform gratitude for his servants. She then asked to be shown to her room so she could change out of travel clothes that she described as smelling like horse and political desperation. Something shifted in Lucien's expression. It was not a smile. He had not smiled in a way that reached his eyes since he was 19, but it was adjacent to interest. And interest was something Lucien Raventhorne almost never experienced toward other human beings. "Show her to the East Wing," he said. "I will meet her at dinner. And if she refuses dinner, then I will know she is smarter than I expected." She did not refuse dinner, but she was 20 minutes late to it, and when she entered the Great Hall, she was not wearing the formal gown that had been laid out for her. The Great Hall of Blackmere was designed to intimidate. Vaulted stone ceilings disappeared into shadow. Iron chandeliers hung like cages from chains thick enough to moor ships. The dining table was a single piece of black oak that ran the length of the room, polished until it reflected the candlelight like dark water. At the far end, in a chair that was not quite a throne but carried the same implication, sat Lucien. Seraphina walked the full length of that table without hurrying. She wore a simple dark blue dress with no jewelry, no ornamentation, nothing designed to appeal or appease. Her hair was pulled back in a way that was practical rather than decorative. She was not beautiful in the way the court paintings demanded, but there was something in her face, in the set of her jaw, in the way her eyes took inventory of a room without flinching, that made beautiful an inadequate word. She stopped at the opposite end of the table. 30 feet of black oak stretched between them, like a declaration. "Lady Vale," Lucien said. Your Grace. Silence. The fire cracked. Somewhere deep in the castle, a door closed. You are late, Lucien said. You were not at the gate. I assumed punctuality was not a priority in this household. Aldrich, standing near the service entrance, went very still. In 15 years, he had never heard anyone respond to the Duke's observation of a fault with a counter-accusation delivered at the same temperature. Lucien studied her. She held his gaze without effort, without defiance for its own sake, but with the particular steadiness of someone who had decided before entering the room exactly how much ground she was willing to surrender. The answer appeared to be none. Sit, he said. That sounded like a command. It was. Then no. The word landed in the great hall like a stone dropped into still water. The servants along the walls exchanged glances. Aldrich's hand tightened around the back of the chair he was standing behind. Lucien rose from his seat. He moved slowly, the way predators moved when they wanted their prey to understand that speed was available but unnecessary. He walked the length of the table until he stood 3 feet from Seraphina, and at this distance, the difference in their physical presence was stark. He was over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, radiating the kind of controlled menace that had made grown men sign over their estates rather than face him in a negotiation. Seraphina did not step back. She did not flinch. She tilted her chin up to maintain eye contact, and something in her expression suggested that she had been tilting her chin up at people who tried to tower over her for a very long time. You are in my home, Lucien said quietly, eating my food, sleeping under my roof, protected by my name. When I say sit, you sit. I am in your home because a chancellor decided I was a convenient political tool. I am eating your food because the alternative is starving, which I have come closer to than you might imagine. I am sleeping under your roof because my family's roof was sold to cover debts I did not create. And I am protected by your name only because your name apparently needs a woman attached to it to appear legitimate. She paused. So when you say sit, I will decide whether the chair is worth the cost. The silence that followed was so complete that the rain against the window sounded like applause. Lucien looked at her. Really looked. Not the way he assessed threats or evaluated assets, but the way a man who had forgotten that other people could surprise him looked at the first surprise he had encountered in years. You have a mouth on you, Lady Vale. I have a mind behind it. The mouth is just the delivery system. He almost smiled. Almost. The muscles in his face remembered the motion, but did not commit to it. Sit down, he said again, and this time the command was softer, though softness from Lucien Raventhorne was a relative concept, like saying a blade was duller than the one beside it. Please. The word cost him something. She saw it. She sat. Dinner was served. Roast venison, root vegetables, bread that was still warm. Seraphina ate with the focused efficiency of someone who had recently learned not to take meals for granted. Lucien ate almost nothing. He watched her instead, which she ignored with the discipline of someone who understood that acknowledging scrutiny gave it power. Your father, Lucien said eventually. He agreed to this arrangement. My father agrees to anything that delays the consequences of his decisions. This arrangement delays them permanently. You speak about him without affection. I speak about him with accuracy. Affection and accuracy are rarely compatible when discussing men who gamble away their daughters' futures. And yet you came. I came because the alternative was watching my younger sister and my mother lose the last house they have. I came because someone in my family needed to make a sacrifice that was not rooted in stupidity. I came because when the options are pride and survival, pride is a luxury I can no longer afford. She said all of this without self-pity. That was what struck Lucien. There was no performance of suffering, no bid for sympathy. She delivered the facts of her situation the way a general delivered a battlefield report, clinical and clear, and stripped of everything that did not serve the objective. He understood that. He had been speaking that language since he was 19. You will find Blackmere cold, he said. I grew up in a house where the fireplaces did not work for 3 winters because my father sold the chimney copper. I know cold. I am not talking about the temperature. Their eyes met across the table, and for a single moment the mask they both wore slipped just enough to reveal the architecture beneath. His was built on control and isolation. Hers was built on endurance and the refusal to break. They were not the same structures, but they had been built with the same material. Pain and the absolute determination to never let it win. I know what you are talking about, Seraphina said, and I am not afraid of you. You should be. Probably, but fear requires energy, and I have been rationing mine for years. The days that followed were a steady and controlled collision. Seraphina moved through Blackmere with a quiet efficiency that unsettled the staff. She did not ask for tours or explanations. She observed, catalogued, and drew her own conclusions. Within 2 days, she had identified the structural weaknesses in the East Wing's foundation, the inefficiency in the kitchen supply chain, and the fact that 3 of the household servants were stealing wine from the cellar. She reported none of this to Lucien. She mentioned it to Aldrich during a morning walk through the grounds. Delivered with the same clinical detachment she applied to everything. Aldrich reported it to Lucien, who listened in silence and then said, "She found the wine theft?" "In 48 hours. It took you 3 months. I am aware of that, Your Grace, and I would prefer not to dwell on it." Lucien stood at his desk, reviewing correspondence from the border garrisons. The reports were routine. Troop movements along the northern frontier were stable. Trade convoys were running on schedule. The iron shipments to the capital were meeting their quotas. Everything in his empire was functioning with the mechanical precision he demanded, and yet he could not focus. She was in the library. He knew this because he had asked Aldrich, which was a weakness he recognized and despised. The library was on the 2nd floor of the Western Tower, a room he rarely entered because books were tools he used when necessary and discarded when finished. The idea that someone would sit among them voluntarily for hours struck him as either deeply intelligent or profoundly impractical. He suspected with growing irritation that Seraphina Vale was both. The irritation was the problem, not because he could not control it, but because he could not identify its source. Lucien Raventhorne did not experience confusion. He experienced obstacles, and he eliminated them. But Seraphina was not an obstacle. She was not an enemy. She was not an ally. She occupied a category he had no framework for, and the absence of a framework made him feel something dangerously close to uncertainty. He hated it. He found himself thinking about it constantly. On the 4th morning, he found her in the courtyard, standing in the rain without a coat, examining the stonework of the outer wall with her fingers. "You will catch your death," he said from the covered walkway. "The mortar between these stones is failing," she said without turning around. This section was repaired within the last decade, but whoever did the work used river sand instead of quarry sand. It is going to crumble within 2 years. Lucien stepped into the rain. It soaked through his shirt immediately, cold as accusation. He stood beside her and looked at the wall. She was right. He could see the hairline fractures she was tracing with her fingertips. "How do you know about masonry?" he asked. "When your family cannot afford to hire tradesmen, you learn to do the work yourself. I repointed the entire south wall of our manor house when I was 17. My mother held the ladder. My father was in London losing money." She said it without bitterness. That was the thing that kept catching him off guard. Bitterness he could have dismissed. Anger he could have categorized. But this woman had transformed her suffering into competence, and competence was the one quality Lucien Raventhorne could not ignore. "I will have the section repaired," he said. "With quarry sand." "With quarry sand." She looked at him then. Rain ran down her face, flattening her hair against her skull, and she looked nothing like a noble woman. She looked like something weathered and real, and entirely unwilling to pretend otherwise. "Why are you out here?" she asked. "Because you were." The honesty of the answer surprised them both. Lucien's jaw tightened, and Seraphina's eyes widened just enough to betray that she had not expected vulnerability from the devil of Blackmere. "Go inside," he said, harder than necessary. "The wall will survive the rain. Whether you will is another matter." "Is that concern, Your Grace?" "It is an observation about the limits of human physiology." It sounded like concern. "Then your hearing needs examination along with your judgment." She smiled. It was small, brief, and entirely real, and it did something to Lucien's chest that he would spend the next 3 hours trying to identify and the next 3 days trying to forget. Mas. Lord Cassian Meyermont arrived at Blackmere on a clear morning 1 week after Seraphina's installation, riding through the main gate with 4 attendants and the kind of smile that men wore when they were calculating the value of everything they saw. He was Lucien's cousin on his mother's side. 31, fair-haired, handsome in the polished way that aristocratic breeding sometimes produced. Cassian possessed the social graces that Lucien had never bothered to develop, and the political ambition that Lucien had never needed to develop, because he already held what Cassian wanted. Blackmere. The rivalry between them was old and layered and rooted in a dispute over inheritance that had never been formally resolved. Lucien's father had named Lucien sole heir. Cassian's branch of the family had contested the will, arguing that the estate should have been divided. The courts had ruled in Lucien's favor, but courts resolved legal questions, not human ones, and Cassian's resentment had spent 15 years compounding interest. Lucien received him in the study. He did not offer whiskey. "Cousin," Cassian said, settling into a chair with the ease of a man who believed every room eventually belonged to him. "The place looks well. You have been busy." "I am always busy. What do you want, Cassian?" "I heard you acquired a fiancée, or rather, that one was acquired for you. The Chancellor's work, if the rumors hold." "The rumors hold? What of it?" "What of—" "I came to offer congratulations and curiosity. The great Lucien Raventhorne, who swore he would never share Blackmere with anyone, suddenly entertaining a bride. The court finds it fascinating." "The court finds anything fascinating that distracts from its own incompetence." Cassian smiled. It was the kind of smile that looked warm on the surface and calculated underneath, like a furnace with a painted screen in front of it. "I would very much like to meet her." "No. Come now, Lucien. We are family. We are relatives. Family implies affection. I have neither the time nor the inclination." "You wound me." "I have done worse to people I liked more." Cassian's smile held, but something in his eyes shifted, a recalibration, a reassessment of approach. Lucien saw it. He always saw it. Reading people was not a skill for him. It was a survival mechanism he had developed the way animals developed camouflage, because the environment demanded it. "The Vale family is an interesting choice," Cassian continued, undeterred. "Disgraced name, empty coffers, a father who could not manage a fruit cart, let alone an estate. One wonders what the lady herself brings to the arrangement beyond a convenient bloodline." "One wonders," Lucien said flatly, "why you are still talking. Because information is currency, cousin, and I trade in it." Cassian leaned forward. "The court is watching this arrangement with great interest. There are those who see it as a sign of weakness. The Duke of Blackmere needing the crown's approval badly enough to accept a bride he did not choose. And there are those," Lucien said, "who mistake observation for insight and gossip for strategy. Those people tend to lose." "Do they?" "Historically, yes. Several of them lost to me." The two men regarded each other across the desk. The air between them had the particular tension of a rope pulled to its limit, vibrating with the potential energy of whatever would happen when it snapped. Cassian stood. "I will be staying at the Ashenmere Inn for a few days. Business in the region. Perhaps we might dine together before I leave. You, the lady, myself. Civilized." "There is nothing civilized about you, Cassian. There is only patience, and mine is not infinite." "Nor is mine, cousin." He left. Lucien sat in the silence and did the thing he always did when a threat materialized. He catalogued it, measured it, began constructing the response. Cassian had not come to congratulate him. Cassian had come to assess Seraphina, to determine whether she was an asset or a vulnerability, to find the crack in Blackmere's walls that 15 years of ambition had not been able to create. Lucien had spent his entire adult life ensuring that no such crack existed. He had eliminated sentiment. He had severed connections that could be exploited. He had made himself a fortress within a fortress, a man so armored against attachment that even his enemies respected the engineering. And now there was a woman in his library who smiled in the rain and knew the difference between river sand and quarry sand, and his cousin was circling the castle like a wolf who had caught a new scent. "Bonnet?" That evening, Lucien found Seraphina in the library again. She was reading by candlelight, curled into a chair that was too large for her in a way that made her look smaller than she was. When she looked up, her expression carried neither welcome nor wariness, just the neutral attentiveness of someone who had learned to assess situations before reacting to them. "You had a visitor," she said. "You saw. I see most things in this castle. The windows are well placed for observation, and I have very little else to occupy my time." He sat in the chair across from her without being invited. The fire between them was burning low, throwing unsteady light across the spines of books neither of them was looking at. "My cousin," Lucien said, "Lord Cassian Myrmont. He wants Blackmere. He has wanted it since before I inherited. And he sees me as relevant to that ambition." It was not a question. Lucien looked at her with the particular intensity he reserved for people who demonstrated the ability to see what most people missed. "Yes, because I am either a tool he can use or a weakness he can exploit." "Yes." Seraphina closed her book and set it on the arm of the chair. "Which am I to you?" The question was direct in a way that most people were not capable of when speaking to the Duke of Blackmere. Direct questions required the willingness to receive direct answers, and direct answers from Lucien tended to leave marks. "I have not decided," he said. "Then let me help you. I am not a tool because I will not be wielded. I am not a weakness because I refuse to break. And I am not a decoration because this arrangement was made without my aesthetic preferences being consulted." She paused. "What I am is someone who survived a family's destruction with her mind intact, who agreed to this arrangement because it was the least terrible option available, and who would very much like to understand the rules of the game she has been placed in before someone uses her as a pawn without her knowledge." Lucien said nothing for a long time. The fire crackled. The rain started again outside, lighter now, tapping against the windows like fingertips asking for entry. "The rules are simple," he said finally. "Trust no one. Assume everyone has an agenda, and never let anyone see what you are willing to lose, because that is exactly what they will take from you. Those are your rules. Those are the rules that kept me alive. They also kept you alone." The observation landed with surgical precision. Lucien felt it in his chest, in the place where he had built the thickest walls, and for a fraction of a second, something behind those walls shifted. Not collapsed, not weakened, but shifted. The way tectonic plates shift, imperceptibly, inevitably, with consequences that would not be visible for months. "Alone is safe," he said. "Alone is also a cage," Seraphina said. "The difference between a fortress and a prison is whether the door locks from the inside or the outside. You built Blackmere to keep everyone out. Have you considered that it might also be keeping you in?" He stood abruptly. The chair scraped against the stone floor with a sound like a blade being drawn. "You have been here 1 week," he said, and his voice carried the cold edge that made lesser men back away from negotiations. "You do not know me. You do not know this place. And you do not get to diagnose me like I am one of your crumbling walls in need of repointing. I repoint what needs fixing. It is the only useful skill poverty taught me. I do not need fixing. Everyone needs something. The question is whether you are brave enough to admit it." He looked down at her, and she looked up at him, and the space between them vibrated with something that had no name yet but would, given time, become the most dangerous thing either of them had ever encountered. "Good night, Lady Vale," he said. "Good night, Your Grace." He turned and walked toward the door. He was 3 steps from the threshold when her voice stopped him. "Lucien." It was the first time she had used his name, not his title. His name. It moved through the room like a match struck in darkness, small and bright, and capable of starting fires. He stopped, but did not turn. "Your cousin," she said. "He is not just ambitious. I watched him from the window. The way he looked at this castle was not envy. It was entitlement. Men who feel entitled do not negotiate. They take." Lucien stood with his back to her, and the silence stretched between them like a bridge over a chasm neither of them was ready to cross. "I know," he said. He left the library and walked through the dark corridors of Blackmere, with the sound of her voice still lodged somewhere beneath his ribs. In the courtyard below, the rain fell on repaired walls and failing mortar, and somewhere beyond the gates, in the comfortable rooms of the Ashenmere Inn, Lord Cassian Myrmont was writing a letter to 3 members of Parliament, outlining the case for why the Duke of Blackmere was no longer fit to hold his title. The letter ended with a single line: "The woman is the key. Break her, and the fortress falls." Orchestrated cinematic narrative continuation with dialogue-heavy storytelling and embedded philosophy. Orchestrated cinematic narrative continuation with dialogue-heavy storytelling and embedded philosophy. This story is entirely fictional and created solely for entertainment purposes. All characters, locations, and events are products of imagination. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. But the letter reached Parliament before the week was out. Lucien did not know this yet. What he knew was the wait of 3 o'clock in the morning inside Blackmere Keep, the corridors empty, the torches guttering in wall sconces that had held fire for 3 centuries. He stood in the war chamber with his hands flat on the map table, staring at troop positions along the northern frontier that no longer held his attention because something closer had become the more immediate threat. Her voice. The way she had said his name. Not as a title wielded or a weapon brandished, but as a word that meant a specific human being. And the fact that he had not corrected her meant something he was not prepared to examine. Lucien Raventhorne had survived 15 years of political warfare by treating every emotional response as intelligence to be analyzed and then discarded. Sentiment was noise. Attachment was vulnerability. The men who allowed themselves to feel things were the men who ended up signing treaties that cost them everything because someone across the table had found the nerve they could not protect. He had no unprotected nerves. He had made certain of it. And yet he had walked out of that library carrying the sound of his own name like a splinter lodged beneath his skin, too small to remove, too sharp to ignore. He poured whiskey and did not drink it. He stared at the glass the way a man stares at a door he is not sure he should open. "You are awake at an unreasonable hour," Aldrich said from the doorway. "So are you. I am awake because I heard you pacing. The floors in this castle are stone, Your Grace. Subtlety is not available to a man your size." Lucien picked up the glass, considered it, set it down again. Cassian's visit was not social. No. He is making a move. I can feel it the way you feel a storm before the sky changes. Aldrich entered the room and closed the door behind him. His face in the torchlight looked older than his years, carved by decades of watching the Raventhorne family tear itself apart and reassemble in configurations that never quite held. "I have contacts in the capital," Aldrich said carefully. "There are whispers that Cassian has been meeting with Lord Pemberton's deputy, separately from official channels." Pemberton's deputy, not Pemberton himself. Pemberton is the Chancellor. He brokers arrangements. His deputy, Lord Hargrove, is the one who enforces them, or dismantles them, depending on which direction the money flows. Lucien turned from the table. His eyes had the flat mineral quality they took on when his mind shifted from reflection to calculation, when the human being retreated and the strategist emerged. It was a transformation Aldrich had witnessed hundreds of times, and it never failed to remind him that the boy he had raised had become something both magnificent and deeply concerning. "Cassian does not have the resources to challenge me directly," Lucien said. "He needs institutional support. Parliament, the Chancellor's office, perhaps the military garrisons if he can turn enough commanders. And what does he offer them in return? Predictability. I am the Duke they cannot control. Cassian would be the Duke they install, which makes him the Duke they own." He paused. "It is not a bad strategy. It is exactly what I would do if I were trying to unseat someone like me. The difference being that you would succeed. The difference being that I do not underestimate my opponents. Cassian does. He always has. It is the flaw he inherited from his mother's side of the family, the conviction that wanting something badly enough constitutes a plan." Aldrich was quiet for a moment. "And the Lady Vale? Where does she fit in his calculations?" The question landed in the room like a blade dropped on stone. Lucien's jaw tightened. He picked up the whiskey and this time drained it. "She is what he thinks I care about," Lucien said, "which makes her the target. Do you?" "Do I what?" "Care about her?" The silence that followed was not empty. It was packed with 15 years of walls in a single week that had somehow found cracks in all of them. "It does not matter what I feel," Lucien said. "It matters what he believes I feel. Perception is the weapon, not reality." Aldrich studied him with the weary patience of a man who had watched too many Raventhorns confuse emotional suppression for strength. "That answer, Your Grace, is the most frightened thing I have ever heard you say." Lucien's eyes snapped to him. For a moment, the cold authority that kept an entire region in line was aimed at the one person who had earned the right to be its target without consequences. "Go to bed, Aldrich." "As you wish." He moved toward the door, then stopped. "She is not your mother, Lucien. Not every woman who enters Blackmere leaves destruction behind her. My mother left more than destruction. She left a template, and I have spent my entire adult life making sure no one ever uses it again." Aldrich left without responding because there was nothing to say to a wound that old. Some damage did not heal. It calcified. It became the skeleton that held everything else upright, and removing it meant watching the entire structure collapse. Morning brought Frost and a rider from the capital. The rider carried a sealed letter bearing the Chancellor's mark. Lucien read it in his study while Seraphina took breakfast alone in the small dining room, a habit she had established after the first night's confrontation at the great table. She preferred the smaller room. It did not require her to perform formality for an audience of servants, and it allowed her to eat without being watched by a man whose attention felt like standing too close to a fire you could not control. Lucien broke the seal and read the letter twice. The Chancellor's language was measured, diplomatic, and devastating. The Crown had received communications from concerned members of Parliament regarding the Duke of Blackmere's suitability for continued governance of the Northern Territories. Specific concerns had been raised about the Duke's temperament, his refusal to participate in parliamentary proceedings, and the unconventional nature of his recent betrothal arrangement. The Chancellor recommended that the Duke attend the Winter Sovereign Ball in the capital to address these concerns directly and demonstrate his continued commitment to the Crown's interests. Recommended. The word was a leash made of silk. Lucien set the letter on his desk and sat with it for 10 minutes, reading the subtext the way a surgeon reads an injury, layer by layer, measuring depth. Cassian had moved faster than expected. The parliamentary concerns were manufactured, seeded by his cousin's meetings with Hargrove, and amplified through whatever network of allies Cassian had assembled. The Winter Sovereign Ball was the stage. The audience was every lord and lady with a vote or an opinion, and the performance they wanted was his. He found Seraphina in the courtyard. She was watching the farrier shoe one of the draft horses, standing close enough to feel the heat from the forge, studying the process with the same analytical focus she applied to everything. "We have been summoned to the capital," he said without preamble. She did not turn from the farrier. "Summoned by whom?" "The Chancellor. There is a ball. We are expected to attend." Expected or commanded? In politics, the distinction is decorative. Now she turned. The morning light caught the angles of her face, and Lucien noticed, with an irritation that was becoming familiar, that he had started cataloging the way light interacted with her features the way he cataloged military intelligence. Automatically. Compulsively. Without permission from the part of his brain that was supposed to maintain discipline. "A ball," Seraphina said. "In the capital. Where your enemies are. Where everyone is. Which functionally means the same thing. And I am part of this performance. You are the reason for it. Cassian has raised questions about our arrangement. The Chancellor wants a public display of stability, unity, whatever theater the court requires to feel reassured that the Duke of Blackmere is not a liability." Seraphina wiped forged soot from her hands with the focused deliberation of someone processing anger through physical motion. "So I am to stand beside you and smile for people who would dismantle both of us if given the opportunity?" "Yes." "And if I refuse?" "Then Cassian gets exactly what he wants, a fractured front. Evidence that this arrangement is as hollow as he is telling Parliament it is." She looked at him. The distance between them was less than 4 feet, close enough that he could see the pulse in her throat, the faint tension in her jaw, the way her eyes processed information before her expression committed to a response. "You need me," she said. It was not a question, and it was not a taunt. It was a statement of fact delivered with the precision of a blade finding the gap between armor plates. Lucien's chest tightened. The response that rose was the one he had trained himself to give, the deflection, the reassertion of control, the cold reminder that he did not need anyone. But the words that came out were different, and they came out because somewhere in the wreckage of that week, Seraphina Vale had damaged the mechanism that filtered what he felt from what he said. "I need someone at that ball who will not flinch when the court turns hostile. I need someone who can see through political performance and respond in real time. I need someone who is not afraid of me, because everyone at that ball will be, and fear makes people useless." He paused. "So yes, I need you." The admission cost him more than any negotiation he had ever lost. She saw it. She always saw it. That was the problem, and the miracle of Seraphina Vale. She saw the machinery behind his armor, and she did not use it against him. "Then we go to the capital," she said, "but I have conditions." "You are not in a position to set conditions." Everyone is in a position to set conditions. The question is whether the other party can afford to refuse them. He almost respected her too much to argue. Almost. "Name them." "First, I am not a prop. If we walk into that ball together, I walk as your equal, not your accessory. I speak when I choose, to whom I choose, and I do not defer to you in public unless I agree with what you are saying. That is not how aristocratic marriages function. This is not a marriage yet, and even when it is, I will not perform submission for an audience. I did not survive my father's destruction by being decorative." Lucien's jaw worked. The muscles in his neck corded. He was not accustomed to negotiation on personal terms, only on political ones, and the difference was that political negotiations did not make his pulse do things he could not control. "Second," she continued, "I want to know everything, every threat, every alliance, every piece of intelligence you have about Cassian's plans. I will not walk into a room full of enemies operating on partial information. You either trust me with the full picture, or you find someone else to stand beside you. Trust is not something I distribute. Then learn. Because I am not going to the capital as a blind woman in a room full of wolves. I am either your partner in this, or I am nothing, and nothing is exactly what Cassian wants me to be." The word partner hung in the air between them like a key offered across a threshold. Lucien had not had a partner in anything since Aldrich, and Aldrich was not a partner so much as a witness, someone who stood beside the wreckage and helped clear it without ever being consulted about whether the wreckage was necessary. Seraphina was offering something different, something that required him to open doors he had welded shut years ago and allow another person into rooms where the architecture of his decisions was visible, including the ugly parts, including the parts he had built with materials that would not survive examination. "You ask a great deal," he said quietly. "I ask what the situation demands. If that feels like a great deal, it is because you have been operating alone for too long." He looked at her, and the morning light was merciless. It showed everything. The exhaustion beneath his authority, the isolation beneath his control, the fact that this woman, who had arrived at Blackmere with nothing but a ruined name and the refusal to break, had identified in 2 weeks what 15 years of political opponents had never found. The door was locked from the inside, and she was not trying to break it down. She was asking him to open it. "We leave in 4 days," he said. "I will brief you on Cassian's network tonight. Aldrich will provide the intelligence files. And my first condition? You walk as my equal, if you can keep up." The ghost of a challenge crossed her face. "I have been keeping up with men who underestimate me since I was old enough to understand what underestimation looked like. You will not find me lacking." He believed her. That was the terrifying part. Preparations for the capital consumed the following days. Lucien briefed Seraphina in the war chamber each evening, spreading intelligence reports across the oak table and walking her through the political landscape with the clinical thoroughness he applied to military operations. She absorbed it without notes, asking questions that demonstrated not just comprehension, but strategic thinking, the kind that anticipated moves 3 steps ahead. On the second evening, she identified a connection between 2 parliamentary members that Lucien had missed. Lord Ashwick and Lord Pemberton's deputy shared a trade interest in the eastern provinces that created a vulnerability Cassian could exploit. Lucien stared at the documents, then at her, then back at the documents. "How did you see that?" he asked. "Because I spent 3 years managing my family's collapsing finances. When you are desperate, you learn to see where money moves, and money always leaves a trail." He filed this away the way he filed everything about her, with the growing awareness that his filing system was becoming less about strategic assessment and more about the particular architecture of who she was. On the third evening, Aldrich delivered a report from his capital contacts. Cassian had secured a speaking position at the Winter Sovereign Ball. He intended to address Parliament's concerns about the Blackmere governance directly, positioning himself as the reasonable alternative to his volatile cousin. "He is going to challenge your legitimacy publicly," Seraphina said, reading the report over Lucien's shoulder. Her proximity registered in his body before his mind could intervene. a warmth along his left side, the faint scent of the library's old leather and candle wax that she carried in her hair. He has been challenging it privately for 15 years. Going public means he believes he has enough support to win. Does he? I do not know. And that is what concerns me. She placed her hand on the table next to his, not touching, close enough that the distance between their fingers was measurable in fractions of inches and felt like the distance between one country and another. Then we make sure he loses, she said. We. They departed for the capital on a morning sharp with frost. The carriage bore the Raventhorne crest, black iron against gray steel, and 4 mounted guards flanked it on each side. Aldrich rode alongside, his expression carrying the particular gravity of a man who knew that every mile closer to the capital was a mile closer to a battlefield where the weapons were words and the casualties were reputations. Inside the carriage, Lucien and Seraphina sat across from each other. The road was rough, and the silence between them had the quality of a held breath, full of everything neither of them was saying. 30 miles from the capital, a rider intercepted them on the King's Road. The rider was young, mud-splattered, breathing hard. He handed a sealed message to Aldrich, who read it and then brought it to the carriage window. Lucien took the message. He read it. His face did not change, but his hand closed around the paper slowly, deliberately, the way a man closes his hand around a weapon. "What is it?" Seraphina asked. "Cassian has filed a formal petition with Parliament. He is requesting an official review of the Blackmere inheritance on grounds of mental and moral unfitness." Lucien's voice was level, controlled, the kind of controlled that a blade is controlled when it is pressed against a throat. "He is not just challenging my governance. He is attempting to strip my title." Seraphina's face went still, not with fear, with recognition. She had seen this before. The moment when a slow collapse became an avalanche, when the damage that had been accumulating in private suddenly went public and became irreversible. "And the evidence for this petition?" she asked. Lucien looked at her across the narrow space of the carriage, and his eyes held something she had not seen in them before. Not anger, not calculation. Something raw. Something that looked like the expression of a man watching the walls he had spent his life building begin to crack from the inside. "You," he said, "the evidence is you. Cassian is arguing that my acceptance of this arrangement proves I have been compromised, that I am no longer governing rationally, that a woman of no standing and a disgraced family has been installed in Blackmere as proof that the Duke has lost control of his own house." The carriage rocked over a rut in the road. The world outside was winter fields and bare trees and a sky the color of old steel. Seraphina looked at the man across from her, the man who had just been told that her presence in his life was being used as the weapon to destroy him, and she made a decision that neither of them would be able to unmake. "Then we do not defend," she said. "We attack." Seraphina, "He wants to use me as evidence of your weakness. Fine. Let him try. But when we walk into that ball, he will discover that the woman he planned to use as a weapon has a mind of her own and no intention of being wielded by anyone." Her eyes burned with something that was not anger, but its more dangerous cousin, conviction forged in years of watching powerful men destroy things, because no one had the spine to stop them. "You brought me into your war, Lucien. Now let me fight in it." The carriage rolled toward the capital, and behind them, Blackmere Keep stood against the winter sky like a question that had not yet been answered. Ahead of them, the Winter Sovereign Ball waited, and with it, the moment when everything Lucien Raventhorne had built would either hold or shatter, depending on whether he could do the one thing his entire life had trained him never to do: trust someone other than himself. This story is entirely fictional and created solely for entertainment purposes. All characters, locations, and events are products of imagination. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. The capital smelled like ambition and rot in equal measure. Lucien had always known this about it. The wide boulevards and the gas-lit windows and the marble facades were architecture designed to make power look permanent, but underneath the stone and the ceremony, the capital was a city held together by competing interests and mutual blackmail. He had navigated it for 15 years by being the thing everyone feared more than they feared each other. That calculation had just changed. The carriage passed through the capital's northern gate as dusk settled over the city, and Lucien spent the final miles reviewing everything he knew about the Winter Sovereign Ball's guest list, cross-referencing it against Cassian's known allies, looking for the configuration that would tell him where the first move would come from and how hard he could afford to hit back without giving Parliament the spectacle of volatility Cassian was banking on. Seraphina sat across from him and said nothing. She had been quiet since her declaration on the King's Road, not with the silence of someone who had retreated, but with the silence of someone who was loading. He had learned the difference over the past week. Her stillness was never empty. It was always preparation. They were housed in Raventhorne's capital residence, a townhouse on Sovereign Row that Lucien used perhaps 4 weeks out of any given year. The staff had been notified and the rooms prepared. Aldrich managed the arrival with his usual efficiency while Lucien stood in the entrance hall and felt the particular weight of a city that had just been informed he was in it. Word traveled fast in the capital. It always had. "The ball is tomorrow evening," Aldrich said, appearing at his shoulder. "Cassian arrived 2 days ago. He has been seen dining with Lord Hargrove and 3 members of the Northern Committee. How many on the Northern Committee does he need to move the petition forward?" 5 of 9. He currently has 3 confirmed. 2 are considered persuadable. Names: Lord Fenwick and Lady Caldwell. Fenwick holds trade interests along the Blackmere iron route. He fears disruption above all else. Caldwell lost her family's military contract 3 years ago when you restructured the garrison supply chain. She has not forgiven it. Then Cassian has 2 very motivated targets. Lucien removed his coat and handed it to a footman without looking at him. "Get me everything on both of them. Every debt, every alliance, every pressure point." "And Lady Vale?" Lucien glanced toward the stairs. Seraphina had gone up without being directed, had found her room without assistance, as if her entire life had been training her to navigate hostile territory without maps. "Brief her tomorrow morning, early. She asked for the full picture, and I gave my word." Aldrich nodded, and in his expression was the faint but unmistakable quality of approval that he almost never deployed. "She is not what I expected. She is not what anyone expects. That is both the problem and the advantage." The Winter Sovereign Ball was held in the Crown's Assembly Hall, a building designed in the previous century to make everyone who entered it feel simultaneously honored and insignificant. The ceilings were 40 feet high. The chandeliers held 400 candles each. The floors were black and white marble that had been polished until they reflected the room above like a second world built upside down beneath your feet. Every noble family of consequence was present. The air was thick with perfume and calculation, and the particular tension of people who were all performing versions of themselves they did not entirely believe in. Lucien entered with Seraphina on his arm. The room did not stop. Rooms at this level of society never stopped for anything as obvious as a dramatic entrance. But it shifted. The way a tide shifts when the moon moves, subtle and total and felt in the chest before it was visible. Eyes moved toward them, and away and back again. Conversations absorbed the new information and recalculated. Seraphina felt it. He knew because her hand tightened fractionally on his arm, not with fear, but with the adjustment of someone taking a precise grip on a tool they were about to use. She was wearing dark burgundy, a dress that Aldrich had sourced from a capital modiste in 24 hours. It was not elaborate. It was not designed to dazzle. It was designed with the same spare precision that characterized everything about her. Clean lines, good cloth, nothing that required apology or performance. She looked like someone who had earned the right to be in the room rather than been placed there. "Cassian is at the East Colonnade," she murmured. "He has been watching the entrance. He started watching the moment we crossed the threshold." Lucien did not look east. "Who is with him?" "Hargrove. 2 men I do not recognize, and Lord Fenwick." He felt something tighten in his chest. Fenwick already before the evening had properly begun. Cassian was not waiting. "We separate," Lucien said quietly. "You take the western reception. Caldwell will be there. Do not approach her directly. Let her approach you." "And if she does not?" "She will. You are the woman attached to the man she blames for her family's contract loss. Her anger will not allow her to ignore you." Seraphina absorbed this. What do I say to her? The truth, that the restructuring of the garrison supply chain was not personal, that the contract was inefficient and costing the crown money that could have been directed to the families depending on those garrisons. Make her understand that the enemy was never me. It was an administrative system that was failing everyone. And if she does not believe me, then she does not. But she will have heard it from a woman who has no obvious reason to lie for me, and that matters more than what I could tell her myself. He felt her look at him with something he could not quite name, not admiration and not surprise exactly, but the recognition of a mind encountering another mind that works in a way it respects. "Go," he said. She went. Lucien spent the first hour of the ball moving through rooms the way he moved through everything, with the appearance of ease and the reality of total surveillance. He spoke to 3 parliamentary members who were publicly neutral, read their discomfort as confirmation that Cassian had been in contact, and planted 3 precisely calibrated pieces of information about the Iron Root's economic value to their specific constituencies. He did not approach Cassian. He let Cassian come to him. His cousin materialized at his shoulder near the central hall with the practiced ease of a man who had spent his life in rooms like this one. The surface was all warmth and social grace. Underneath was the careful positioning of a man who had made his move and was waiting to see how the board responded. "Lucien, you look well." "Cassian? I was not certain you would attend. After the news of my petition, I thought perhaps discretion might win out over defiance. I have never been known for discretion." "No, that is true." Cassian sipped from his glass and surveyed the room. "She is striking, your Lady Vale. Not what the court expected from you." "The court's expectations are not my concern. They are becoming your constraint, though." Fascinating distinction. Cassian turned to face him directly, and underneath the social surface, the thing that had been building for 15 years was fully visible now. Not hatred. Hatred was a simple emotion. This was entitlement colliding with reality after a very long freefall. "The petition will pass, Lucien. I have the votes. You have 3 confirmed, you need 5. I had 3 confirmed a week ago. Political situations develop." The smile. Always the smile. "Fenwick came to me this morning, and I had a very productive conversation with Lady Caldwell last night." Lucien kept his expression level. Caldwell had moved to Cassian before the ball, which meant she had been in contact with him before their arrival, which meant Cassian had approached her before Lucien had known the threat was this immediate. He had miscalculated the timeline by at least 48 hours. He filed the error away and said nothing. "You were always better at the long game than the short one," Cassian said. "But some situations require immediacy. The petition goes before the committee in 3 days. By the time you organize a response, the vote will already be recorded." He set his glass on a passing tray. "I am offering you one alternative. Withdraw from the arrangement with Lady Vale. Announce it publicly tonight. The petition disappears, and you retain Blackmere under a governance agreement that includes parliamentary oversight." "Parliamentary oversight? You mean your oversight?" "I mean stabilizing oversight, the kind that reassures the Crown that Blackmere will never again be a political liability." Lucien looked at his cousin. He looked at the 15 years of resentment wearing a tailored coat and a reasonable expression, and he felt something that was not anger, but its colder cousin. The thing he felt when he understood a situation completely, and the understanding brought no comfort. "No," he said. "Lucien, no." He turned from Cassian and walked away, and the single word carried the weight of every refusal he had issued in 15 years, none of which he had regretted, and all of which had cost him something. He found Aldrich near the service corridor at the northeast corner of the hall. Aldrich's face told him immediately that whatever he was about to hear was not good. "Fenwick and Caldwell," Lucien said, "both confirmed as of this afternoon. But there is something else." The quality of Aldrich's voice triggered a response in Lucien's nervous system that he had learned to trust absolutely. It was the voice Aldrich used when something had happened that fell outside the category of manageable problems. "Tell me, the intelligence files, the ones I gave Lady Vale yesterday morning, detailing Cassian's parliamentary network and our counter-strategy." Aldrich's face was stone. "Cassian had a copy of them tonight. Hargrove showed 2 pages to Lord Fenwick over dinner to demonstrate that you had been surveilling parliamentary members and compiling leverage files. It is being framed as coercion." The world did a very quiet thing. It rearranged itself. Lucien stood in the noise of the ball, 300 people and 400 candles and a marble floor reflecting it all back doubled, and he felt the rearrangement with the physical precision of something structural failing. A beam, a foundation stone, something that everything else had been built on. Only 3 people had had access to those files: Aldrich, himself, and Seraphina. "Where is she?" he said. His voice was very quiet, very level, the voice he used when he was controlling something that wanted very badly to be uncontrolled. "Western reception room. She was speaking with Lady Caldwell when I last—" He was already moving. The Western reception room was smaller than the main hall, warmer. The kind of room where the real conversations happened while the performances ran in the rooms designed for them. Seraphina was standing near the window when Lucien entered, alone now, holding a glass she had not been drinking from. She read his face the moment he entered, and something shifted in hers. Not guilt. He was watching for guilt, and he did not find it. What he found instead was a woman who had already registered that something had gone catastrophically wrong and was trying to understand what it was before he reached her. He closed the distance between them in 4 steps and stopped with less than 2 feet separating them and said absolutely nothing. Let the silence do what silence did when it was loaded. "What happened?" she said. "Cassian had the intelligence files tonight." The color left her face. Completely. The way color leaves a landscape when the light source goes out. "Lucien, 3 people had those files. I need you to tell me, right now, without preparation or calculation, how that is possible." "I did not—" She stopped. Her eyes were moving the way they moved when she was processing at speed. And he watched her do it, watched her pull the threads, and what he saw in her face was not the reconstruction of a lie, but the reconstruction of an event. The specific, horrified reconstruction of something she was realizing as he watched. "My rooms," she said. "Last night, I left the files on the writing desk when I went to change before dinner. I was gone perhaps 30 minutes. Your rooms were locked. The rooms in this house communicate through a service corridor. I did not know that." Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. The glass was shaking very slightly, just enough to catch the light. "Someone went through the service corridor, copied what they needed, and left. I did not hear anything. I did not know." He looked at her. The part of him that had been built specifically for this, for the moment when trust revealed itself as the most expensive vulnerability in existence, was fully operational. It was telling him what it always told him, what he had told himself since he was 19 and watched his mother hand his father's correspondence to a man who used it to ruin him. People let you down. The ones you let close did it with the most precision. "Lucien." Her voice broke slightly on his name, and he had to actively resist the effect it had on him because this was not the moment for that. "I know what this looks like. I know what you are thinking, but I need you to hear me." "I am hearing you." "No. You are calculating. You are deciding whether to discard me before I can cause more damage. That is not the same thing as hearing." The accuracy of it hit him like a blade he had not seen coming. He stood with it in him and did not show it. "The petition goes before the committee in 3 days, he said. "With those files framed as coercive surveillance, I have no counter-argument that does not look like further coercion. Cassian has won the narrative." "Then we change the narrative." "How?" "I do not know yet. But I know that standing in this room deciding whether to trust me is exactly what he wants you to do. He wants you alone. He has been engineering you alone since before I arrived at Blackmere." She stepped forward. 1 step, deliberate, into the space that was the last barrier between whatever this was between them and something neither of them had language for. "I am not your mother. I am not the person who hands your vulnerabilities to your enemies. I am the person who walked into your fortress and refused to break, and I am telling you, with everything I have, that I did not betray you." The noise of the ball was distant through the walls. The candles were burning down. Outside the window, the Capitol moved through its evening with complete indifference to the 2 people standing inside it, trying to determine whether the damage was survivable. Lucien looked at her. The man built from isolation and refusal looked at the woman built from endurance and defiance. And he did the thing that went against every lesson his life had ever taught him. He believed her. Not because belief was safe, not because the evidence was conclusive, but because 15 years of reading people had given him an instrument more reliable than logic, The ability to distinguish between the performance of innocence and the reality of it, and what he saw in Seraphina Vale's face was not a performance. It was a woman who was furious that someone had used her against the person she had decided to stand beside. "All right," he said. 2 words. The most expensive 2 words he had ever spoken. "All right," she repeated, and her voice was uncertain in a way it almost never was. "I believe you. Now help me figure out who accessed those rooms, because Cassian did not come to this city and execute a plan this precise without someone inside this house." She exhaled. Just once. Short and controlled, but he saw the relief move through her and he stored it somewhere he did not have a name for. "The service corridor," she said. "Who has access?" "Every senior member of the household staff, which means 12 people." He paused. "And Aldrich." The name fell between them with the weight of 15 years. Seraphina was very still. "You cannot believe—" "I do not want to believe it, but I have been in this city for 16 hours and my operational files are already in Cassian's hands. The only person with consistent access to both my intelligence and my household is Aldrich Voss." He stopped. The thing in his chest was not grief exactly, because grief required a certain capacity for loss that he had buried long ago. But it was adjacent. It was the shadow grief cast. "He has been with my family for 30 years. That is exactly the kind of long relationship Cassian would cultivate, slowly, patiently, over years, building obligation or leverage or both. Lucien did not respond because he was doing the thing he did when reality required full processing and partial processing was not sufficient. He was remembering every moment over the past 3 years where Cassian had been ahead of him by exactly the right margin. Not enough to be obvious, just enough to be effective. The border garrison that had nearly turned, the trade contract that had been undercut by a competitor who should not have known the terms, the parliamentary vote 2 years ago that had gone against Blackmere despite Lucien's certainty he had the numbers. Every one of those moments, Aldrich had been present for everyone. "He warned me about Cassian," Lucien said, and the words tasted like ash. Consistently, reliably. Every time there was a threat, Aldrich was the first to identify it. Because he knew about it in advance. He identified the threats he was helping to create. The wall at his back might as well have been the floor. Everything was reorienting. 30 years of loyalty reclassifying itself in real time as something darker. Not hatred of Aldrich, not yet, because what he felt was not simple enough for hatred. It was the particular devastation of discovering that the architecture of your life was built on a foundation that was never what you believed it was. This was what Cassian had been building toward. Not just the petition, not just the public challenge, the total dismantling of the one thing Lucien Raventhorne had never fully protected because he had never believed it was vulnerable, his past. "If it is Aldrich," Seraphina said quietly, "then everything he has ever told you about threats and enemies requires re-examination. Every decision you made based on his intelligence." "Yes, and Cassian has had 30 years of access to the interior of Blackmere's decision-making." "Yes." The word landed twice. The second time was worse. She reached out and put her hand over his, and it was not a romantic gesture, and it was not a strategic one. It was the gesture of a person who understood what it meant to have the ground removed from beneath you and wanted to provide the only thing that was actually useful in that moment. Contact. Evidence that someone was still there. Lucien looked down at her hand on his. He had been touched very little in his life, and always with purpose. Handshakes and negotiations, and the clinical contact of a physician once when he had been wounded in a border skirmish. This was different. This was the kind of touch that asked nothing and offered something he did not know how to receive. He turned his hand over beneath hers, slowly, and held it. "Tomorrow," he said, "we confirm whether it is Aldrich. If it is, I deal with it, and then we deal with Cassian." "How?" He looked up from their joined hands to her face, and something in his expression was different from anything it had been before. Not open exactly, not warm in the way warmth was usually performed, but cracked. The way stone cracks when it has been under sufficient pressure for sufficient time. Not broken. Cracked. And through the crack, something that had been buried for 15 years was finding its way toward air. "I have spent my entire life governing through fear," he said. "Cassian is counting on me to respond to this the way I respond to everything, with force, with dominance, with a display of power that confirms every concern the committee has about my fitness to hold Blackmere. Then do not. No, he agreed. I will do something I have never done in 15 years in front of Parliament, something Cassian has no counter for because he has never seen it from me and has no framework for responding to it. What? Outside the window, the Capitol burned with its 1,000 lights, and inside the western reception room, the Duke of Blackmere made the decision that would either save everything he had built or accelerate its collapse with a speed that no amount of power could reverse. I will ask for help, he said, publicly, from the one person no one expects me to trust. He looked at her, and she understood, and for a single second, before the armor came back and the calculation resumed and the machinery of survival re-engaged, she saw the man underneath the Duke. He was terrified, and he was still standing. This story is entirely fictional and created solely for entertainment purposes. All characters, locations, and events are products of imagination. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. He found Aldrich at midnight. The old steward was in the townhouse study, seated at the correspondence desk with a glass of brandy and the expression of a man who had been waiting for a conversation he had known was coming. That expression, the absence of surprise, told Lucien everything he needed before a single word was spoken. He closed the door. He did not lock it. Locking it would have implied he needed to contain what was about to happen, and he did not. What was about to happen was very simple and very quiet and more devastating than anything that had occurred in the assembly hall that evening. "How long?" Lucien said. Aldrich set down the brandy. His hands were steady. He had the steadiness of a man who had already made his peace with a thing and was now simply waiting for it to arrive. 4 years, Aldrich said, since the northern garrison dispute. 4 years. Lucien stood with that number and felt it move through him like water through cracked stone, finding every gap, every foundation, every moment he had believed himself secure. He approached you. He had evidence of certain financial arrangements I made during your father's final illness. Funds I redirected to cover debts your father had accumulated that would have been public if left unresolved. I protected the family. Cassian found out and decided that protection made me useful. You could have come to me. You were 19 years old and you had just buried your father and taken control of an estate that was quietly dissolving at the seams. You needed to believe that at least one thing in your life was solid. Aldrich looked at him with the eyes of a man who had carried something for 4 years and was relieved beyond measure to set it down, even at this cost. I told myself I was managing it, that I could feed Cassian enough to satisfy him without giving him anything that truly mattered. The garrison vote 2 years ago. Yes. The undercut contract. Yes. The intelligence files tonight. A pause that lasted exactly long enough to be a different kind of answer than a simple yes. He told me the files were to be used to demonstrate your strategic capability to potential allies in Parliament, that it would strengthen your position. And you believed that. I wanted to believe it. There is a difference, and I am not proud of it. Lucien walked to the window. Outside, the capital's street lamps burned in rows, and somewhere in the city, Cassian Miermont was in a comfortable room reviewing the damage he had engineered and calculating the final moves. The petition committee convened in 3 days. The parliamentary network was aligned. The intelligence files were weaponized. From where Cassian was sitting, the board was won. The financial records, Lucien said, the ones he used to compromise you? Where are they? His solicitor's office in the capital. Hargrove holds a copy as insurance. I need them destroyed, both copies. Lucien, not for you, for the family name. My father's reputation is the only inheritance I did not spend rebuilding, and I will not have it used as Cassian's exit strategy. He turned from the window. I'm not going to destroy you, Aldrich. I'm also not going to pretend this did not happen. What I need from you right now is whether there is anything else. Any other piece of information Cassian holds? Any other leverage point he has not used yet? Aldrich was quiet for a moment, and in that silence, Lucien saw the full scope of 30 years collapse and reassemble into something smaller and more honest and infinitely more painful. He knows about your mother, Aldrich said. The full account of what she did. Not the version that became court gossip, the documented version. What she took from your father's correspondence and who she gave it to and what it was used for. Lucien's jaw set. That is not leverage. That is ancient history. It is leverage if he presents it as evidence of a pattern, that Blackmere men are vulnerable to women who exploit their blind spots, that you have repeated your father's mistake. Aldrich's voice was old and tired and genuinely regretful. He is going to use it at the committee hearing, not just the intelligence files. He is going to argue that Lady Vale is your mother 40 years later. Different name, same design. The room was very still. The candles burned without wind. Somewhere outside, a horse moved on the cobblestones, and the sound was very far away. Lucien thought about Seraphina. He thought about her hand turning under his in the reception room, about the way she had said his name when no one was listening, about the woman who had identified failing mortar and supply chain inefficiencies, and the difference between a fortress and a prison. He thought about the fact that Cassian was going to stand before a parliamentary committee and tell them that she was a predator, a schemer, a repeat of the woman who had destroyed a duke's career 50 years ago, and that the argument would be constructed from enough partial truth to be devastatingly effective. Then we do not let him make that argument unchallenged, Lucien said. He left Aldrich in the study and went to find Seraphina. She was awake. He had not expected otherwise. She was seated at the small writing desk in her room with paper in front of her and nothing written on it, which told him she had been thinking rather than planning, processing rather than strategizing. When he entered, she looked at him and read his face with the speed she always brought to reading him, and what she found there made her set down the pen. "It was Aldrich," she said. "Yes." "Is he—" "He stays. Under conditions." Lucien sat in the chair across from the desk. He was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the hour and everything to do with the particular weight of a day that had dismantled things that were supposed to be permanent. "Cassian has one more weapon, my mother," he told her. All of it. He had never told anyone the full account, not even Aldrich, who had lived through it. But he told Seraphina in the specific factual language he used when emotion was present but control was necessary, and she listened without interrupting, without performing sympathy, without any of the reactions that would have made it harder to speak. When he finished, the silence lasted 10 seconds. "He is going to stand before that committee," she said, "and tell them I am a repetition of a woman I have never met, using a history I had no part in to destroy a man I chose to stand beside." "Yes." "Then I will be at that committee hearing." "It is not open to—" "I will be there." Her voice carried a quality he had come to recognize as the sound of a decision already made, not stubbornness. Resolution. The kind that had been formed in the furnace of necessity and could not be unmade by argument. "You said you were going to ask for help publicly, from the one person no one expects you to trust." She met his eyes. "Then let me stand in that room and speak." "Seraphina, if it goes wrong—" "If it goes wrong, I lose a name that is already half ruined, and you lose a title under a process that is already in motion. The downside is the same whether I am in that room or not. The upside only exists if I am." He looked at her across the narrow desk in the candle-lit room and felt the thing that had been building since the moment she arrived at Blackmere fully materialize into something he could no longer categorize as anything other than what it was. Not strategy, not alliance, not the cold calculus of mutual interest. He was in love with her. He had been moving toward it since the first night in the Great Hall when she refused to sit on command, and the knowledge of it now was not soft or romantic or any of the things the word suggested in the poetry he had never read. It was structural. It was the recognition that something had become load-bearing without his permission, and removing it would bring down the roof. It was the most dangerous thing that had ever happened to him. "All right," he said, and the words came out quieter than he intended. "We go in together. Mchamed." The parliamentary committee convened in the Sovereign Court's Eastern Chamber at 10 in the morning, 2 days ahead of the original schedule. Cassian had petitioned for early hearing, citing urgency and the Duke's presence in the capital as an opportunity for immediate resolution. The chamber was not designed for public attendance, but it accommodated observers, and the observers that morning included enough political weight to constitute a second parliament of informal opinion. Word had traveled through the capital's networks with the speed that only genuine drama could generate. The Duke of Blackmere, summoned to answer for his fitness. Lucien entered with Seraphina beside him and did not look at the gallery. The 5-member committee was seated at an elevated bench. Lord Hargrove represented the Chancellor's office. 2 hereditary lords and 2 elected parliamentary members completed the configuration. Their faces were arranged in the careful neutrality of people who had been briefed and had opinions and were performing the absence of both. Cassian was already present, seated to the left of the chamber's central floor. He looked well, composed. The look of a man who had worked toward a single objective for 4 years and was watching it arrive on schedule. The committee chairman, Lord Dunmore, opened the proceedings with the formal language of institutional process, reading the petition's grounds in the level voice of a man who had presided over enough of these to have excised all personal investment from the procedure. When Dunmore finished, he invited Cassian to present his argument. Cassian stood. He was good at this. Lucien had always acknowledged, privately and with the cold respect of one strategist for another, that his cousin's political instinct was genuine. He spoke without notes, in the conversational register of a man sharing reasonable concerns rather than prosecuting a case. He cited the intelligence files. He cited the unorthodox nature of the betrothal arrangement. He cited Lucien's refusal to participate in parliamentary proceedings over the previous decade. And then, as Aldrich had warned, he cited the history. Lucien's mother, the correspondence, the damage, and the argument that followed, quiet and reasonable and precisely aimed, that the Duke of Blackmere had installed a woman of obscure motive and compromised family into the seat of northern power, and that the parallels to a pattern of catastrophic judgment in the Raventhorne line were not coincidental but structural. The chamber was very quiet when Cassian sat down. Lord Dunmore looked at Lucien. The Duke may respond. Lucien stood. He had prepared language. He had prepared a response to the intelligence file accusation and a counter-argument for the governance record and a line-by-line refutation of every parliamentary concern Cassian had raised. He had the material for a defense that was airtight and cold and entirely consistent with every public performance he had given for 15 years. He set it aside. "I'm not going to defend my record," he said. "My record exists. 15 years of it. Every trade agreement, every garrison report, every economic outcome in the Northern Territories is documented and available to this committee. If the committee believes that record constitutes unfitness, then the committee's standard for fitness requires re-examination, not my tenure." A murmur in the gallery. He let it settle. "What I will address is the argument my cousin has made about judgment, about pattern, about the woman beside me." He did not look at Seraphina. He had told her not to stand until the specific moment. "Lord Miramont has suggested that Lady Seraphina Vale represents a vulnerability in my decision-making, a repetition of a historical failure. He has constructed an argument designed to make a woman who has nothing to do with my mother's choices appear to be her continuation." He paused. The chamber's silence had a texture. Lady Vale came to Blackmere without resources, without allies, and without any obligation beyond the one the Crown's arrangement created. In the 3 weeks since her arrival, she identified a structural failure in my keep's outer wall that my staff had missed for a decade. She identified a theft operation in my household that my own steward had not caught in 3 months. She identified the connection between Lord Ashwick and Lord Hargrove's deputy that I had missed in my own intelligence analysis. He stopped. She did these things not because I asked her to, because the problems were present and she was constitutionally incapable of ignoring them. Another pause. Shorter. My mother gave my father's correspondence to his enemies because she was promised something in return. Lady Vale has given me nothing but accurate information and direct disagreement, which is more than I can say for most of the people in this room. He looked at Cassian directly for the first time. Including the man who has spent 4 years feeding my operational intelligence to the cousin who filed this petition. The murmur became something louder. Dunmore raised his hand for order. "I have documentation," Lucien said. "Names, dates, specific pieces of intelligence transmitted from my steward to Lord Miremont's household. A pattern of information transfer spanning 4 years and corresponding precisely with every setback my governance has experienced in that period." He reached into his coat and placed a folder on the committee table. "The source of those documents will be available for the committee's verification. What the committee will find is that the security concern in the North is not the Duke. It is the man asking you to replace him." Cassian was on his feet. "This is fabricated." "Lord Miremont." Dunmore's voice had the edge of a man who had just recalculated the entire situation. "You will wait." Cassian sat. His composure was intact, but something behind it had shifted. the way a wall looks the same a moment before it gives way. Dunmore looked at the folder, then at Lucien. "You said Lady Vale would speak." "She will." Seraphina stood. She had no notes either. She stood in the chamber in the dark burgundy dress, with her hands at her sides and her chin at the angle that Lucien had come to recognize as the angle she used when she was operating at full capacity and had decided not to waste any of it on performance. "I'm not a political operator," she said. "I'm not a strategist or a spy or a woman with a design on the Blackmere title. I'm a person who agreed to an arrangement because my family needed it and because the alternative was watching people I love lose the last thing they had." She looked at the committee without flinching. "I have been in Blackmere for 3 weeks. In that time, I have argued with the Duke on 4 separate occasions, disagreed with his methods twice, and told him once that his castle was a cage he had built for himself. None of that is the behavior of a woman running an operation. It is the behavior of a woman who refuses to pretend that power is a substitute for sense." A beat. "Lord Myrmont wants you to see me as a threat to northern stability. I would ask you to consider whether a woman who spent her first week at Blackmere fixing structural masonry and identifying supply chain inefficiencies is the profile of someone destabilizing an empire, or whether she might be, by some measure, exactly what an empire that has been run entirely by fear for 15 years actually needs." She sat. The chamber was silent long enough to be significant. The committee did not rule that day. They recessed to review Lucien's documentation and consult with the Chancellor's office directly. Hargrove left the chamber with the expression of a man recalculating his own exposure. Cassian's legal representative requested a private consultation that the committee declined. Outside the chamber in the marble corridor, where the capital's political architecture announced its own permanence from every angle, Lucien stood with Seraphina and felt the day's weight settle into his bones. "You did not use the language I prepared," she said. "No. It was better. It was honest, which is different." She looked at him, and the corridor was full of people moving past them with the velocity of people who had just witnessed something they needed to report, and in the middle of all of it, the two of them were very still. "What happens now?" she said. "The committee issues a ruling within 48 hours. If my documentation holds, and it will hold because it is accurate, Cassian's petition collapses. He faces potential countercharges for the intelligence operation. Hargrove distances himself from the situation immediately. And Cassian himself. Cassian will not accept collapse." Lucien's voice was very level. "He has spent 15 years and 4 years of active operation building toward this. Men who have invested that much do not accept a committee ruling and go home. He will make a move. Something outside the institutional process. You expected this. I planned for it." He looked at her directly. "Which is why I need you to return to Blackmere tonight, before he does." Her expression changed. "Lucien, listen to me." He kept his voice low and his face neutral, because they were standing in a public corridor and the walls had ears that reported to everyone. "The committee ruling takes 2 days. In those 2 days, Cassian has nothing left to lose institutionally. The move he makes will not be political, it will be direct. And the most direct target he has is Blackmere itself." She understood. He watched her understand it, the specific horror of a woman who had been to war long enough to see the trajectory. "You think he will move on the keep?" "I think he has been planning for the scenario where the institutional approach fails. Men like Cassian always have a contingency. The petition was the clean version. What comes after it is not clean." "Then I should stay with you. You should be at Blackmere because if he moves on the keep and there is no one there who can coordinate the garrison response, 300 people who live and work within those walls are unprotected." He paused. "I need you there. Not as a hostage and not as decoration. As the person who knows the walls, knows the staff, knows the supply chains, and the structural vulnerabilities." He stopped. "As the person I trust." The words cost him what all true things cost him. Everything. Seraphina looked at him for a long moment, and then she did something he did not expect. She reached up and put her hand against the side of his face, brief and precise and devastating in its simplicity, the way a person touches something they are not certain they will see again. "Come back," she said. "That is not a condition I can guarantee. I did not say it was a condition. I said, come back. She left for Blackmere before nightfall with 4 of his best-trained guards and Aldrich, who had one final piece of service to perform and was determined to perform it correctly. Lucien returned to the townhouse and began preparing for what he already knew was coming. It came at 3 in the morning, not assassins, not the crude tool of a man with no remaining options. Something more considered than that, which told Lucien that Cassian had been more prepared for institutional failure than he had calculated. The writer arrived with a message written in Cassian's own hand. 3 lines. I have Blackmere. I took it 6 hours ago with the garrison support you did not know I had purchased. Come alone or I burn the east wing with everyone in it. Lucien read the message once. He set it on the desk. He looked at the wall across from him, at the iron sconce and the flame and the shadows it threw. Seraphina had left 4 hours ago. She would have arrived at Blackmere 1 hour ago, which meant she was already inside when Cassian's men moved. He had sent her directly into the trap. The thing that moved through Lucien Raventhorne's chest in the following 30 seconds was not fear. He had managed fear out of himself long ago. What it was the specific and catastrophic recognition of a man who had spent 15 years protecting himself from exactly this kind of consequence and had failed at the single moment it mattered. He had let someone in, and she was now inside a burning building because of it. He was already moving before the thought completed. Coat, blade, horse. No guards because the message said alone, and he was going to honor the letter of the demand long enough to get inside the walls, at which point all agreements were void. He rode for Blackmere through a night that was black and cold and offered nothing in the way of reassurance, and inside his chest, underneath the armor and the control and the 15 years of fortress construction, something was running at a speed he had never felt before. Not strategy, not calculation. Something rawer and older and far more dangerous. The thing that made a man capable of burning down everything he had built in order to save the one thing that had somehow become worth more than all of it. The keep appeared on the ridge as dawn's first gray light began to separate the sky from the land, and through the east wing windows, Lucien could see the orange flicker of fire already eating at the stone. He rode harder. This story is entirely fictional and created solely for entertainment purposes. All characters, locations, and events are products of imagination. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. The east wing was burning from the inside out. Lucien came through the main gate at full gallop and pulled his horse to a stop in the courtyard where 6 months ago there had been nothing but cold stone and routine. Now there were men he did not recognize posted at the inner doors, garrison soldiers wearing Blackmere colors over loyalties that had been quietly purchased over 4 years by a man with patience and a grievance and enough coin to make both of those things effective. He counted 8 visible, estimated 12 more inside. Cassian would not have moved on a fortress with fewer than 20, which meant the real question was not the number but the configuration, where they were positioned, which corridors they controlled, and where Seraphina was inside all of it. He dismounted without being stopped because the soldiers at the gate had orders to let him through. Cassian wanted him inside. That was fine. Lucien wanted to be inside. A man who has nothing left to lose moves differently than a man who is protecting assets. Lucien had spent 15 years being the second kind of man, governing through the threat of what he could take from people because the inventory of what he stood to lose was carefully managed and deliberately small. He had believed that was strength. He understood now, riding through the gate of his own burning keep, that it was a different kind of cage. You could not be fully dangerous if you were always protecting something, and you could not be fully alive if the thing you were protecting was only yourself. One of the posted soldiers stepped into his path. Young, uncertain in the way soldiers were uncertain when the person they had been told to contain arrived and did not behave like someone who understood they were contained. His lordship is in the great hall, the soldier said. I know where my great hall is, Lucien said, and walked past him. He found the east wing corridor first. The fire was on the upper floor, contained for now to 2 rooms but spreading through the old timber framing with the appetite that 3-century-old wood brought to every fire it encountered. Smoke was moving down the stairs in slow gray curtains. 2 servants were at the end of the corridor, pressed against the wall, And when they saw Lucien, the relief on their faces was the specific relief of people who had been waiting for the person responsible for their safety to arrive and had not been certain he would. "Where's Lady Vale?" he said. "The Great Hall, Your Grace. Lord Myrmont had her brought there when he arrived. She is unharmed." Unharmed. The word did a specific thing to his chest that he did not have time to examine. "Get everyone out through the west courtyard. The fire will reach the main corridor within the hour if it is not contained. Take whoever is in the servant quarters and the kitchen and move them out. Do not wait for orders from anyone wearing that insignia." He indicated the soldiers' positioning with a single gesture. "Go." They went. He turned toward the great hall. But Cassian had arranged the great hall with the instinct of a man who understood theater, which was, Lucien had always known, his cousin's genuine talent. The iron chandeliers were fully lit. The long black oak table held maps and documents that Cassian had clearly brought with him, the paperwork of a man who had arrived not for a confrontation, but for an installation. He intended to be sitting at that table when the dust settled, reviewing the administrative transfer of Blackmere as if it were a transaction that had already been completed. Seraphina was standing near the far wall, not restrained. Cassian was too careful for the optics of physical restraint. She was simply positioned between two of his men with the particular stillness of someone who had assessed every exit and found them all monitored and had decided that stillness was more useful than motion until the situation changed. She looked at Lucien when he entered. Her eyes moved across him with the speed she always brought to reading him, checking for injury, checking his face, checking the calculation behind his expression. Whatever she found there settled something in her own posture. Not relief exactly. Readiness. The adjustment of a person who had been managing alone and was now no longer alone. Cassian stood near the head of the table. He looked, in the candlelight of the great hall, like a man who had arrived at the destination of his life and found it exactly as he had imagined it. That was the most dangerous thing about him. He genuinely believed this was his. "You came alone," Cassian said. "You asked me to." "I did not expect compliance. I came alone because I did not need anyone else." Lucien walked into the room at an even pace, hands visible. Nothing in his manner that suggested urgency or desperation, because urgency and desperation were information, and he was not giving Cassian any more information than he already had. "This ends tonight, Cassian. However you want to play the next hour, it ends tonight. It ends tonight with you signing the governance transfer. Blackmere passes to my administration under parliamentary oversight. You retain the title nominally. You retain the townhouse in the capital." Cassian's voice was reasonable. It was always reasonable. "It is a better outcome than the committee would have given you. The committee was not going to rule against me. You know that. The documentation I submitted this morning dismantled the petition. The petition was never the primary strategy." Cassian moved around the end of the table with the ease of a man who had rehearsed the geography of this moment. "The petition was pressure. This is resolution. You burned part of my keep. I contained a fire in a wing that was already structurally compromised. The masonry report from your own household confirmed it. A beat. Lady Vale's assessment, actually. Useful woman. She documented the problem thoroughly." Lucien did not look at Seraphina. He kept his eyes on Cassian with the focus he used in negotiations where the cost of distraction was measured in things that could not be recovered. "Sign the transfer," Cassian said, "and I call off the soldiers, contain the fire, and Lady Vale is free to go wherever she chooses. Her family's debts remain resolved. She loses nothing. She loses Blackmere. She was in Blackmere for 3 weeks. That is not what I mean." Something shifted in Cassian's expression. The first real shift of the evening, the first crack in the reasonable surface. He looked at Lucien with the eyes of a man reassessing a calculation he had been certain was complete. "You actually care about her," Cassian said. And then, with the particular cruelty of someone who had just found a pressure point they had not known existed. "That is new." "Sign nothing," Seraphina said from across the room. Both men looked at her. She had not moved from her position near the wall, but her voice carried the full length of the great hall without effort, clear and direct, and carrying the specific authority of a person who had decided to stop being a spectator in a room where her future was being negotiated. "Lucien, do not sign anything." Cassian looked back at Lucien with an expression that had recalibrated into something more complex than the reasonable administrator he had been performing. Control your... She is not mine to control, Lucien said. She never was. That is the thing you never understood about her. He moved, not toward Cassian, toward the soldier on Seraphina's left. He covered the distance before the man had completed the decision to raise his weapon, and what followed was not elegant and not cinematic but real, the ugly, pragmatic violence of a man who had trained for 15 years because Blackmere's borders were not maintained by paperwork. The soldier went down. The second man on Seraphina's right moved, and she moved first, bringing her elbow back into his jaw with the precision of someone who had been planning that movement since she identified the angle 20 minutes earlier. The man sat down on the floor with the stunned expression of someone who had not accounted for the woman he was guarding. Lucien reached her. She was already standing straight, breathing hard but controlled, her eyes bright with the specific aliveness that extreme situations produced in people who were built for them. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No, you." "No." Cassian's voice came from behind them, and it had lost the reasonable surface entirely. What was underneath was older and raw and finally honest. "This changes nothing. I have 20 men in this keep, and the east wing is burning, and you have nowhere to go that I have not already covered." Lucien turned to face his cousin. Across the great hall, across the table that had held 15 years of Blackmere's administration, across the distance between a man who had built something and a man who had spent his life believing he deserved it, they looked at each other with the specific clarity that only comes when all the performances have been stripped away. "You are right," Lucien said. "You probably have more men in position than I can deal with tonight. The East Wing will cost me significant structural repair. The committee ruling is still pending, and the capital is still watching." He paused. "You have built a strong position, Cassian. I will give you that. 4 years of work, and you built a genuinely strong position. Then sign." "No." Cassian drew the blade at his side. It was a formal gesture as much as a practical one. The acknowledgement that the institutional phase of this conflict was finished, and what remained was older and more direct. "I will not ask again." "You will not need to." What Lucien did next was the thing he had been moving toward for 15 years without knowing it. Not the fighting, though the fighting came, but the decision behind it, the choice to stop governing through the threat of loss and start acting from the reality of what he was willing to fight for without any guarantee of outcome. A man with nothing to lose was dangerous. Lucien had always known that. He had spent his entire career making sure no one could use that kind of desperation against him by ensuring he was never desperate. But there was another kind of dangerous, the kind that came not from having nothing to lose, but from having something so worth keeping that the calculation of personal costs simply stopped being relevant. He crossed the great hall and met his cousin in the space between the table and the fire. The fight was not long. Cassian was capable, trained in the formal style that aristocratic households produced, technically proficient and physically capable. But technical proficiency was built for controlled conditions, and Lucien had not operated in controlled conditions since he was 19. He had been built by the kind of necessity that formal training did not replicate. The border skirmishes and the hostile negotiations and the 15 years of maintaining a fortress by being willing to be the most dangerous thing in any room he entered. Cassian's blade caught him across the left forearm. The cut was clean, and it burned, and Lucien registered it the way he registered all physical damage during combat, as information rather than impediment. He took Cassian's weapon hand at the wrist on the second exchange, applied pressure to the joint with the specific knowledge of where bone met bone at its most vulnerable angle, and held it until the blade hit the floor. He put Cassian against the wall of his own great hall and held him there with one forearm across his chest, and his breathing was hard, and his forearm was bleeding onto the floor that had been in his family for 3 centuries. Cassian looked at him with eyes that had finally run out of calculation. What was left was the thing beneath all the strategy, the thing that had been driving the 15-year campaign from its foundation. Not ambition, exactly. Grief. The specific, unprocessed grief of a man who had grown up believing something was owed to him and had spent his entire adulthood in the shadow of its absence. Lucien looked at his cousin and understood this with a clarity that surprised him, because he knew grief that had been converted into architecture. He had built an entire empire out of his own version of it. "It was never yours," Lucien said, and his voice was not cold. It was something closer to exhausted and honest. "It was never going to be yours. Not because you were not capable, Because my father chose me, and that choice was legitimate regardless of what you built your life on believing. Cassian's jaw worked. You have no idea. I have every idea. I watched my mother make the same conversion, pain into strategy, grief into operation. It does not work. It only delays the reckoning. He stepped back, released him. It ends tonight. The men stand down, the fire gets contained, and you leave Blackmere and do not return. The parliamentary documentation I submitted this morning will be reviewed, and the outcome of that review is no longer something I intend to interfere with. You are letting the committee rule against me. I am letting the process run. Whatever it produces, it produces. He picked up Cassian's blade from the floor and set it on the table between them. Take it, and go. Cassian looked at him for a long moment. The man who had spent 4 years dismantling Lucien Raventhorne from the inside looked at the man who was still standing in the great hall of Blackmere Keep, bleeding on the floor, and in his eyes was something that was not defeat exactly, but its more complicated relative. The recognition that the thing he had wanted could not actually have given him what he was looking for, that the keep was stone, and the title was a word, and neither of them was the thing the wound actually required. He took the blade. He left without speaking. His men stood down before the hour was out. The East Wing fire was contained by dawn. 3 rooms were lost. The structural damage was significant but not catastrophic, which was the best summary Lucien had ever heard of a night that had gone the way this one had. He stood in the outer courtyard as the sky lightened from black to the dark blue that preceded sunrise, and the smoke from the East Wing rose against it in slow gray columns that smelled like 300 years of timber finally giving up. Seraphina stood beside him. They had not spoken since the Great Hall. There had been the immediate work of the fire and the soldiers and the coordination of the garrison men who had not been purchased and were now actively assisting with containment. There had been Aldrich, who had managed the household evacuation with the competence of a man performing his final act of genuine service and intending to perform it without error. Now there was the courtyard and the dawn, and the smoke, and the specific silence of 2 people who had been through something together and were standing in the aftermath trying to locate the words for it. The cut on your arm needs proper attention, Seraphina said. It has been bandaged. It needs more than a bandage. It has been properly bandaged. She looked at him. The dawnlight was finding her face the way it always did, without mercy, showing everything. And he had stopped being able to pretend that he did not look at her face the way a man looked at something he was learning by heart. You came back, she said. You told me to. I did not think that would be sufficient motivation for a man who makes all of his decisions based on strategic calculation. It was not strategic. She was quiet for a moment. The smoke moved. A bird somewhere in the valley below the ridge began the day's first sound, small and clear, and entirely indifferent to everything that had happened in the keep above it. What was it? She said. He looked at the burning East Wing and then at the courtyard where 300 people had lived and worked and been protected by the walls he had spent 15 years reinforcing. He thought about his father and his mother and Aldrich and the template he had built his entire life to avoid repeating. He thought about all the architecture he had constructed to keep this exact moment from being possible. The isolation and the control and the 15 years of governing through fear rather than through anything that could be taken from him. He had built a fortress within a fortress, and she had walked through both of them in 3 weeks without breaking a single wall. She had simply stood in the middle of all his carefully maintained distance and refused to pretend it was sufficient. It was the only decision that made sense, he said, when nothing else was calculable, when every strategic consideration had run out. What was left was the only thing I had not designed a defense against. Which was? He turned from the smoke and looked at her directly, the way he had been looking at her since the first night in the Great Hall when she refused to sit on command, the way a man looked when he had finally stopped pretending that what he was doing was anything other than what it was. You, he said. It was you. The word was not decorated. He had never learned to decorate the things that mattered. But it landed in the space between them with the weight of everything he had spent 15 years not saying to anyone, and she received it without performance, without the affectations of a moment that was already genuine enough not to need them. She put her hand against his chest, over the place where the armor was not, where the years of careful construction had left a gap that he had believed was a failure of engineering and was discovering was the only part of the structure that had been built correctly. "I am not leaving," she said. "I know. I mean that as a statement of intent, not a reassurance." "I know that too." She looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and the dawn came fully over the ridge of Blackmere in the way it had come every morning for 3 centuries, indifferent and reliable and incapable of being impressed by anything a human being had constructed in its light. He put his hand over hers, held it against his chest, felt her breath adjust to match the rhythm of it. It was the most unguarded he had been since he was 19 years old, and it did not feel like exposure. It felt like the specific relief of a man who has been carrying weight for so long that he has forgotten what his own body felt like without it, and has finally, in the moment of setting it down, remembered. The parliamentary committee issued its ruling 6 days later. Cassian's petition was dismissed on the grounds of insufficient evidence for unfitness, and the counter-documentation of intelligence interference was referred for formal investigation. Hargrove resigned from the Chancellor's office before the week was out. Lord Fenwick and Lady Caldwell, finding the political wind entirely changed, submitted letters of support for Blackmere's continued governance that read with the strained enthusiasm of people rewriting history in real time. Aldrich remained at Blackmere under conditions that were never formally stated but were understood by both men with the completeness that 30 years of shared history provided. He was no longer in the intelligence chain. He managed the household. He held the role with the particular dedication of a man who understood that continued presence was a grace he had not earned and intended to spend the rest of his years earning. The East Wing was rebuilt through the winter. Seraphina managed the reconstruction with the methodical focus she brought to every problem that presented itself to her attention. She sourced quarry sand. She interviewed the contractors personally. She found 2 instances of overcharging in the first month and addressed them with the direct economy of a woman who had spent years watching money disappear and had lost all tolerance for it. Lucien watched her do this and felt something he had no adequate framework for, something that was not gratitude exactly and not pride exactly, but the specific quality of recognizing another person's true nature and finding it more interesting and more formidable than anything you had imagined before you knew them. The marriage was performed quietly in the 2nd month, before the committee's investigation concluded, before the East Wing was fully restored, before any of the circumstances were ideal. Lucien had proposed in the library, standing in the same chairs where they had first argued about whether he was building a fortress or a prison, and his proposal had been characteristically without flourish. "Marry me," he had said, "not because of the arrangement, because I am asking." She had looked at him for a long time with the expression she used when she was deciding whether the chair was worth the cost. "Yes," she said, "because I am choosing." The distinction mattered. They both knew it mattered. A choice made freely was the only kind that built anything permanent, and they had both been through enough constructed arrangements and engineered outcomes to understand the difference in their bones. That spring, on a clear morning when the valley below Blackmere was green for the first time since Seraphina had arrived, Lucien stood at the outer wall of the keep and looked at the repaired section of masonry. Quarry sand. Good work. It would hold for another century. Seraphina came and stood beside him, and they looked at it together with the satisfaction of people who had fixed something real rather than performed the appearance of fixing it. "The Northern Garrison commander wants a meeting next week," she said. "The supply chain restructuring is working, but he has concerns about the winter allocation. I will see him. I would like to be in the meeting." He looked at her. "You intend to be involved in garrison administration?" "I intend to be involved in everything that concerns Blackmere." That was the arrangement. The arrangement was a political convenience. The arrangement, she said, with the particular precision of a woman who knew the difference between what a thing had been and what it had become, is now a marriage. And a marriage is either a partnership or it is a performance, and I have told you before that I will not perform. He almost smiled. He had been almost smiling more frequently since winter, and the staff had noticed it with the nervous relief of people watching something they had believed was impossible approach the border of actual occurrence. "The garrison meeting is Tuesday," he said. "You will want the supply chain reports beforehand. I already requested them from Aldrich this morning." He looked at the repaired wall, at the quarry sand, and the good work and the century it was going to hold. He thought about his father and his mother and the template that had governed his life, The conviction that the things you loved became the weapons used against you, and that the only defense was to love nothing. He had been wrong. Not about the vulnerability. He had been precisely right about the vulnerability. The people you allowed into the interior of yourself were exactly the instruments that could destroy you. Cassian had proven that. Aldrich had proven that. But the alternative to vulnerability was not safety. The alternative was the other kind of cage, the one with the door locked from the inside, the one that kept everyone out and kept you in, the one that Seraphina had identified on her second day in the library of Blackmere Keep and had refused, with the absolute stubbornness of a woman who had survived too much to waste any of it on half measures, to pretend was anything other than what it was. Real strength was not the absence of damage. He understood that now with the completeness of a man who had needed the lesson delivered at considerable cost to absorb it fully. Real strength was the capacity to be damaged and to remain standing and to make the decision, deliberately and with full knowledge of the risk, to allow someone to matter enough to make you vulnerable again. He had built Blackmere Keep into the most feared seat of power in the North. He had done it through intelligence and ruthlessness and the absolute refusal to need anyone. And the only thing that had ever made any of it worth having was the woman standing beside him looking at a repaired wall with the same serious attention she brought to everything, already planning the next problem, already thinking 3 steps ahead, already in it with him in the way that meant the long kind of in it, the kind that did not have an exit strategy because it did not need one. He was still feared across the kingdom. That had not changed, and he had not tried to change it, because fear had its uses, and he was not sentimental enough to discard useful things. But the quality of what Blackmere was had shifted, the way the quality of light shifted when a second source was added to a room that had been lit by only one. He no longer ruled through fear alone. He ruled from a foundation that had something else in it now, something that had not been there before, and that could not be engineered or constructed or strategically acquired, something that had walked through his gates on a rainy afternoon, refused to sit when commanded, identified failing mortar in his outer walls, and had somehow, without asking permission or following a plan, become the most essential thing in an empire that had been built entirely on the premise that nothing was essential. He turned from the wall and went back inside. She walked beside him, already talking about the garrison supply chain, already 3 steps into the next problem, and he listened to her voice move through the corridors of Blackmere Keep the way the morning moved through it, filling the old stone rooms with something they had not had in a very long time. The sound of a life being lived rather than managed. The sound of a man who had finally, at considerable cost and against every instinct his history had given him, learned the difference.